we've just gone through one of the most useful parts of TOGAF, and that's part 3, guidelines and techniques. Of course, they support part 2, which is the architecture development method. Architecture development method, part 2, is really the step-by-step approach to reach the objectives that we laid out earlier. Part 3, with guidelines and techniques, it says, what can we do to be more successful in doing the ADM in the real world? So guidelines help us adapt the ADM to different scenarios and different ways to do iteration, different ways to manage the architecture landscape at, for example, the strategic level, the segment level, or the capability level. So we can also use guidelines for scenarios like security, for service orientation, for cloud, for the Internet of Things, for big data analytics. We think about how we're going to tailor TOGAF for our own organization, in our own industry, in our part of the world. All of that involves guidelines. So tailoring TOGAF is going to be essential if you're actually going to use it and not just learn about it. And so it's a very important aspect of TOGAF, is the whole idea of guidelines. And again, we have some as examples, but we can't cover every possible scenario. So it's something that really depends on your size organization and the maturity and the responsibilities, the industry, and all of that in terms of how you could maybe expedite the tailoring. But often it is about streamlining. How can I streamline TOGAF to get traction with it? And one of the things that then ties us right into architecture techniques in part 3, we have the 14 techniques, and that really does tie in to how do I adapt TOGAF? Well, I adapt it in light of my stakeholder concerns, and my stakeholders might be concerned that I not be too heavy with my architecture help, right? So I might want a light footprint. So I might use really more emphasis on stakeholder management, which is a key technique in TOGAF. It kind of drives everything else. So with the stakeholder concerns in mind, I would say, well, I want to have some architecture principles, which we covered, but maybe not too many at first. Maybe I could add some later as people get more used to the architecture folks being involved. And I could get them involved in business scenarios so they could really see the value that we add with thinking through the whole opportunity space and helping understand where we're at versus where we want to be. And that's kind of tied to the idea of gap analysis. And as we do systematically through the ADM, we could say, okay, where are we at from a business perspective versus where we want to be? And from an information systems perspective, which includes your applications and your data, in terms of like your ability to share information across different applications, and the way you can do that maybe working remotely or using mobility for your technology architecture. So you have the idea of your gap analysis there that needs to come into play as a technique as well. Again, we always are doing the stakeholder management part. We're always looking at our principles, but we're also doing gap analysis in B, C, and D in order to say what are the gaps that need to be satisfied in phases E and F. So when we do all of that, we also are doing gap analysis in terms of our readiness. So what's our business transformation readiness now versus what it needs to be? What's our interoperability now from what it needs to be? So again, another kind of gap analysis. And with all these gaps in mind, we could have risk, and so we need to do risk management in TOGAF. Now, everything in TOGAF in terms of how we apply the ADM is it always should be tied to capability, to business capability. So we call that capability-based planning, which is an overarching technique in TOGAF. That everything that we do, every increment of capability that we're rolling out should be tied back to a mandated business capability in a strategic plan or a performance plan, an IT plan, but something that's tied to mandated required capability and not just a nice to have sort of thing. And the other overarching technique in TOGAF is architecture patterns. And that's just saying, how do we put together architecture building blocks with solution building blocks to solve a problem, such as I want to use a smartphone for a hotel key. Okay, but that's abstract. Those would be, what would be reference models, what would be reference architectures, what would be actual solutions I would use. And once I figured out how to do that, how could I write that down and share that so that I don't have to think it through every single time. So architecture pattern is a way I combine building blocks to solve problems. So those are the really key ones. And then we have 5 migration planning techniques that basically basically build off of a couple things. 2 of them just build off the gap analysis because it says, how do I consolidate my gaps? So I have a worksheet that consolidates my gaps. I have a worksheet that says, what ideas have I gathered from doing my gaps? Then I have a couple worksheets that says, how would I show transitions moving from baseline to target? And I have another one that says, how would I decide what to put first in my sequencing? Why would one thing go before another? And that's a business value assessment that would help me look at the value of a work package versus perhaps the risk of a work package. So we see all these things kind of come together with those 14 techniques. So one technique that we haven't covered that's actually a very interesting one and very useful one to consider, something that we are working hard to help folks with, is an analysis of alternatives technique. So how would I decide what's the best scope for a phase A? How would I decide who's the best vendor? How would I decide what's the best solution? So there are various architecture patterns that could be created, or templates that I could reuse over and over again to make different kinds of decisions in different scenarios. And I would tie that to kind of a missing analysis of alternatives technique that TOGAF could have. And this ties back to guidelines for adapting the ADM. One way I would adapt the ADM is to bring in a robust analysis of alternatives approach so that we could be more confident of our decision making throughout. Because after all, TOGAF as a framework, helping to do EA, enterprise architecture, should help us with better informed decisions faster. So the more we can mature with the use of these techniques that I've covered, plus the one I just recommended, the better we'll manage the risk and the better opportunities we'll have for success.